Hello again, and welcome back to Educator.com's Advanced PHP with MySQL course. In the last few lessons, we've been working with learning how to run insert statements from within our PHP code. In today's lesson, we're going to learn how to run select queries from within PHP. We're going to talk a little bit about select queries and how they work as far as returning results. We're going to talk about something we mentioned in our lesson where we first introduced accessing MySQL from PHP, which is the MySQLi_result class, which is part of the MySQLi extension, and it's a class that basically is used to represent results returned from a select query. We're going to talk about the fetch associate method, which is part of this result class, that's going to allow us to basically access information in from the results of the select query. We're going to talk about something called the standard class objects, which are it's basically like a basic object that's built into PHP. We're going to talk about an alternative to fetch assoc, which is fetch object, which is another way to allow us to access information in the results returned from a select query. And then we're going to talk briefly about freeing up a result set memory, which means that freeing up the memory that's occupied by results that are returned from a select query. So basically, select queries return a table of data, and the data that it returns is known as a result set. And you'll hear me use that term. I've actually probably used it before. So when you run a select query, it basically returns a table of data that contains rows. It's called a result set. And actually, if we look at, if I start our MySQL monitor, and I run a select statement on our items table, we can see that this is a result set. This is a table of data that it returns. It has all these, in this case, 6 different rows with 3 different columns. And basically what we do is we're going to be able to basically loop over this result set, processing each row one at a time, extracting any information we need to know. For example, we might want to output the name and price of every item returned by this select query. So the result set that we get returned needs to be processed to extract the data, as we had just mentioned, to extract whatever data we want. And then the memory it occupies, that result set occupies, should be freed. So for example, maybe we run a select query that returns 1,000 items from our database. Let's say you have this huge store. Well, that occupies memory, and so you want to, on the server, so you want to be able to free that memory up. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in the last slide of the lesson. Basically, select queries are run in the same way that we learned how to run our insert queries. You simply run them using the query method of our MySQLi object. The difference is that when you run a select query, it's actually going to return, assuming that the query was successful. If it's not, it returns false. It's going to return a result set that's in the form of this new object that we're going to learn about called MySQLi_results, which is basically an object that encapsulates the result set returned from a select query. So basically, it represents, as I just mentioned, the result set from a query. And as an object, it has properties and methods. One of the properties that it has is num_rows. And basically what that tells you is the number of rows that this particular result set returns. So if we look back at this select query we had run in MySQL Monitor, the result set had 6 rows. So if we ran this through PHP, this result set object would have the num_rows property would be equal to 6. And so that's one of the things we can learn about is how many rows were returned from a query. And then it also has the following object methods for processing a result set. There's one called fetch_assoc, which basically allows you to fetch a row from this result set, one row at a time, and it returns that information from the result set as an associative array, or returns the information from each row as an associative array. It has an analog called fetch_object, which does the same thing, except that instead of returning the data from a particular row in the result set as a associative array, it returns it as an object, and in particular, it returns it as an object of a class type known as standard class, which is a built-in sort of default class type in PHP that we're going to talk about in a little bit. And basically the way the two fetch methods work is that you use them to loop over the rows of a result set. So we saw that our result set for our select query that we just looked at had 6 rows in it. Well, basically what you do is you continually call this fetch assoc or fetch object method on your MySQLi results object. And every time you do that, it's going to return either an associative array or an object representing that particular row. And it will continue to return rows until it reaches the end of the result set. There's no more rows, in which case it will return null. So the way that it basically works, well, first we're going to talk about the fetch assoc method, which again returns an associative array. And basically what it does is it returns an associative array where the names or the keys of the array are the names of the particular columns. So for our example, if this was our particular result set, if we got the first row of this result set using fetch assoc, it would return an associative array of length 3. It would have one key called item ID with the value set to 1001. It would have a key called name set to the value 100% cotton t-shirt, and it would have a key named price set to $15. And so that's the way you would access the different information. So let's say we wanted to output the item ID and name of every item in our items database. Well, we could create a query that says select star from items, which is going to pull all of the column data from items. And then basically what we do is we call this query method. This is assuming that, again, or this is assuming, like in our last lesson, that this DB variable is a valid MySQLi object, which means we've already opened a connection to the database. Assuming that's the case, we've verified that the connection is open. We can run the query method on it, pass it this select query, and then this time we're actually going to be restoring the results in a variable called results. And assuming that the query is successful, it's going to return results, and results is going to be an object of the type MySQLi results. And as mentioned, that class, MySQLi results, has a method fetch assoc as part of it that allows us to fetch each row of the result set as an associative array. So basically what we can do is we can create a while loop to loop over the result set, and basically what it does is it, on each iteration of this loop, it sets a variable we've called row equal to the associative array that's returned next by fetch assoc function. And if you'll notice that this fetch assoc function is called on this results variable, because fetch assoc is a method of the MySQLi underscore result class. And that's key to note, because a common mistake at first is sometimes would be to run it on, for example, our MySQLi object and say db/fetch assoc. So that's one important thing to note, is that we call it on that actual MySQLi result object. And then simply for each iteration through this loop, for each row that we get, we're going to output the item ID of the row, the item ID of that particular row, and the name of that particular item in that particular row. And as you notice here, we're actually doing it, we're accessing it as an associative array, and this is within double quoted strings, which is why we don't have the single quotes around these. And so basically, the way row comes back as an associative array. It's got item ID as one of the keys, and it has name as one of the keys, and we're going to output that. Now this loop is going to continue for each row that's returned in our result set until there are no more results, because what's going to happen, as we learned, when fetch assoc is called and all the results, all the rows have been returned from a result set, it's going to return null. When this evaluates to null, it's going to evaluate to false, and it's going to kick out of the loop. So let's take a look at a script created called fetch assoc. And at the beginning of the script, basically it goes through the 4 steps that we learned about in accessing MySQL from PHP. You open a connection to the database, you run a query, you process the results, and then you close the connection. So here in step 1, this is the same step as we had before in our last example with when we used an insert query. We basically create a new MySQLi object. We test if any errors occurred, and if not, we go ahead and continue. And then we're going to run an SQL statement. In this case, we're running a select statement, and it's going to ask to get the item ID and the name for all of the rows in the table items. And then we're going to run this query using the query method, just as we had done before with our insert query. This time, we're actually going to store the results of this query method, which, assuming that there's no error with the select query will be a MySQLi underscore result object. And then this is where things will be different, is in our processing of the query results. In our last section, or our last example where we worked on running an insert query from PHP code, we would look at the affected rows property and the insert ID property. Well, now we're actually getting back data in the form of this result set object. So we're actually going to do a little more processing here. So this is where step 3 sort of differs a little bit from our insert query. Basically, the first thing we do is we check to see if the number of rows is greater than 0. So we access this numRows property that we had mentioned on the slide. That's a property of that MySQLi underscore result object. As long as that's greater than 0, which means that there were some rows returned in our result set, then we're going to loop over the rows of the result set using this fetch assoc method, and then we're basically going to output the item ID and the name of each row in that table, of each item in that table. If no rows were returned, then we're going to output an a statement that says no rows were returned for the specified query. Finally, as we had in our lesson on using an insert statement from PHP, we complete step 4, which is to close the database connection, and we output an error if there's a problem closing the database connection. So as we can see, we currently have 6 items, or 6 default items in our items database, in our items table, excuse me. So if we go and run this fetch assoc.php script, it's going to run that select query. That's basically going to say, give me the item ID and name of every item in the items table, and then output them. And so when we run it, we can see that that's exactly what it's done. It's output item 1000, ID 1001 is named 100% cotton t-shirt, and then so on for the rest of the items in the particular table. Now, just to show you how the error message would work, let's say that we added a where clause to this query. Say we only want to return the item ID and name from the items table where item ID equals 1007. And we just looked at the output of that select statement on the table, and we saw that there is no item 1007. So this is actually going to return 0 rows. So when we get down here and we access the numRows property on our result set object, it's not going to be greater than 0. And so we're going to output no results were returned for this specific query, just to show you how that works. When we refresh the page, it's going to show no results were returned for the query. So now I just want to talk about a built-in class into PHP that's called standard class. It's basically kind of like a built-in function. It's a class that's basically used to just hold basic data. It's a basic data object, and it has all of its properties that are publicly available. Essentially, you could create in a variable, if you wanted to create an instance of the class, you would do so like this. And then you can just set properties on it, and it'll automatically set them. So for example, we have this new object A that has no properties. Well, we could create a new property on it simply by setting a property name equal to Joe. And then we could access that property simply using the arrow syntax as we normally would on an object, name, and that would output the name that we've set. So basically what we're going to be using in our next example is we're going to be using the fetch object method of our result set class, and what that's going to do is that's going to return our result, the information in a particular row of the result set as an object, and it's going to return it as an object of the standard class type. So this sort of slide here is just to explain what a standard class is. It's basically sort of an empty object that you can populate with data values, and then you can access them by in the same way that you would a regular data object. So fetch object, as mentioned, is going to return the next row of the result set each time it's called, and it's going to return it as a standard class object. And the key is that this standard class object is going to have a property for each column in the result set. So the property names of this standard class object that's returned are going to match the properties of our table. So for example, when we run a select query on our items table, if we were to run this query here and we would get this result set back, when we would call fetch object for the first time on this result set, it would return a standard class object that would have a property called item ID, whose value would be set to 1001. It would have a property named name, whose value would be set to 100% cotton t-shirt, and would have a property named price that would be set to $15. So here we are again. We set up a query that selects all the items, all the rows in the items table. We run the query, and we get our result set back as a MySQLi_result object. And now the only difference, the difference here is that we're going to, when we loop over the result set, we're going to be calling this fetch object method instead and storing that in a row. So now, whereas before, when we would echo information about a row, we were echoing it using an array syntax because it was returned as associative array. Now we return it as an object, so we access it using object syntax, which involves curly braces and then the arrow operator, and then you mention the name of the property that you want. So this would, item ID would refer to the column item ID that's returned. Name would refer to the column name, the value associated with the column name that was returned in this particular row. This is going to loop over our result set until the end of the result set is reached, in which case fetch object like fetch assoc will return null. So basically, these are two ways of doing the same thing. It just depends whether you prefer to use an associative array to access your information or an object. Part of the reason I mentioned both of them is that you'll see both of these used in PHP applications out there, so this will give you experience seeing both of them. The preference that we're going to be using in this course is to use the fetch object method and keep things in an object-oriented manner. So we've also created a fetch object.php script, which is exactly the same as our last script, fetch assoc.php. We create a query, a select query that says get the item ID and name from every row in the items table. We test if the number of rows is greater than 0. And then here, instead of calling fetch assoc in our while condition, we set row equal to the return value from fetch object, which is going to be that standard class object, which with properties that are named according to the columns in the result set. And then here we're just outputting each item ID and the item ID and name of each item using our using the syntax for accessing object properties. So we're going to access the item ID property of this row variable, which is going to be the item ID property of the standard class variable, which is created by fetch object. Here we're going to output the name, and so it's going to output the same information that we had done before. If no rows are returned, it's going to output a message, and then it simply closes the connection as before. So if we go back and we run fetch object again, or this new script fetch object, we can see it does exactly the same thing that we had done before. Just to show you how it sort of works dynamically as the database goes, and to show you that it's actually working when we add new items, I'm just going to add a new item to our database using our the admin site that we created in our last version of the web application. It's going to say item 1007 was added. And so now if we refresh our page that loads all of the items from our items table, we can see that it actually shows up as item 1007 has been added as well. So the last thing I want to talk about in this lesson is it's a method called the free method, which is a method of the MySQLi_result set class, our result set object class. And basically what it does, as mentioned, is it frees memory associated with the result set. As we'd mentioned at the beginning of the lesson, result sets occupy memory on the server, and so when you're done using them, you basically want to deallocate that memory so that it can be used for something else, so you're not basically consuming all the server's resources. The way you do that is you call the free method on your MySQLi_result object when you're done using it, and that frees the memory. And you should always call this after you're done processing a result set, just for the reason of freeing that your resources. So for example, this is the same section of code from our last slide on fetch object, except now at the end we've added this method call free. And basically the method is called on a MySQLi result object. And so again, it's just to make sure that you don't get confused, it's not we wouldn't be calling it on our database object, for example, or MySQLi object, which might be a common mistake at first. It's called on the result set object. So here we just have a script that's been created called free.php. It's the exact same thing as our last fetch object, or actually as our fetch associative script, except that in addition it adds this method call that's going to free up the memory from the result set. So if we look at our fetch assoc, we can see that after the while loop it just goes straight to the else. Here, instead of after the while loop, after the else loop it goes straight into step 4, which closes the database. Here, after our else loop, it goes to this free method and then closes the database. It doesn't affect the output of our script, but it does affect how that memory is going to be freed on the server. Just to show you how it works, when we go ahead and we run free.php, it's going to do the same thing as the other scripts. It's going to load all of the, or request all of the items from the database and then output their item ID and item name. And so basically that's the process for running a select query. And this is sort of an additional step that's also not part of when we ran an insert statement. Our insert statements don't generate a result set, so you don't need to free memory for them, but you do for select queries. So basically to run select queries, our steps are: we open a connection to the database by creating a new MySQLi object. We run our select query using the query method. Then we process the result set that's returned by using either fetch assoc or fetch object. And we can also test for the number of rows that were returned by accessing the numRows property of that MySQLi _ result object. So after we're done processing all of the result set, then we can call, as part of the result processing step, you could say, we're going to call the free method to free up those resources. And then the fourth step for the select statement is, just as we did with an insert statement, is we close our connection to the database using the close method on our DB object. So for today's homework challenge, basically I'd like you to create a script called peopleassoc.php, and basically it's going to run a select query on that people table that you should have created in the last homework challenge. So if you haven't done that, go ahead and create that people table and populate it with some data. Basically, what the select query should do is it just returns all of the rows in the people from the people table, and people table has a num or a person ID column, a name column, and an age column. And so basically, that's the information that it's going to be returned in your result set. So use the number of rows property after you. So go ahead and run that select query. So you're going to open a connection to the database. You're going to run the query. Then I want you to output the number of rows that were returned. Assuming there's more than there's at least one row in the database, you'll at least have one row to output. If there are rows that have been returned from the select query, then go ahead and process the result set by looping over it using the fetch assoc method, and basically output the name and age of each person that's a part of that result set, just in the same way that we had outputted the item ID and item name of each item in our items table. Then I want you to basically do the same thing in a new script called peopleobject.php, which is going to use, instead of fetch assoc, it's going to use the fetch object method, which is going to give you practice using the object-oriented approach to accessing result set data. Make sure that when you're done using the result set, you go ahead and free the memory used by the result sets by calling that free method on the result set object. And one thing that I did mention that's important is that you actually don't want to call that free method until you're completely done accessing or processing your result set data, because once you call free, it eliminates that data from memory and you're not going to be able to access that anymore. So this is sort of the last step that'll be called after you're done accessing all of your result set data and before you close the connection to the database. So that ends today's lesson. Thank you for watching educator.com and look forward to seeing you next time.